Alrighty then. It looks like we are recording. So, here we are. And hello and welcome to question and answer number 190. I am your host, Punyo Basa, slightly tousled. So let's see if we can flatten that lump there. No. Well, I'll just deal with it. Did I mention that I am your host, Punyo Basa? This is my beverage. And 190, fairly obviously, is not prime. In fact, it's very easy to factor out. It is, in fact, 2 times 5 times 19. And I am sitting here before you, today being a gray, rainy, quiet Easter Sunday. And really, we are not celebrating Easter this year. I mean, I haven't eaten a colored egg, have not touched a jelly bean. And to tell you the truth, I am somewhat skeptical of the whole premise of Easter, which is the anniversary of Jesus of Nazareth rising from the dead after being crucified on Good Friday. Why it's called Good Friday, I don't know either. But I am somewhat skeptical that Jesus did actually arise bodily from the dead after dying on a cross, especially if that ossuary that was found in Jerusalem back around 1980 really did contain his bones. So there is that. Let's see here. I guess with that as kind of an introduction, I can just wade into this. I might occasionally have a random thought about Easter throughout the course of this, because it is, at the time of recording this, Easter. So let's see here. First question is from Ethiopian Fake Tig. An Ethiopian Fake Tig says, there are so many people in different traditions that were enlightened, and so many stories exist. So why is it so difficult to be fully enlightened now? Or is enlightenment much simpler? No, this is like a compound question, isn't it? See, there's the question mark, and then he just keeps going. Or is enlightenment much simpler than most people think, and there are at least 1% of people in the world, which is still a lot enlightened out there? Well, let's see here. He says, there are so many people in different traditions that were enlightened. Well, how do you know that? Just because a story says that they were enlightened, it doesn't necessarily mean they were enlightened. So many stories exist. Like a classic example of this is Han Shan, who was considered to be a kind of Zen sage or a Chan sage in medieval China. You know, the stories about him, he's like this mysterious hermit sage. And then, the assumption is that he was fully enlightened. He just accepted as fully enlightened in Chinese Buddhist tradition. And then I actually read the verses of Han Shan. And I mean, a lot of these verses, he's sort of like pining over like for example, I mean, he's just complaining about how he couldn't be a Mandarin because he was thrown off a horse or kicked by a horse or something in his younger years and was lame. And in order to be like a high-ranking official in like medieval China, you had to be physically perfect as well as being a master of like the classical Chinese texts like Confucius and so forth. And so he's like complaining about that. Also, apparently, he was on the wrong side of a kind of coup attempt or some such. And that's why he became like a hermit living out in the forest. It wasn't necessarily that he had a genuine spiritual calling. It's just that he was on the wrong side of a coup attempt or like an abortive civil war. And he just had to flee and hide. And some of his verses, I mean, he's just like complaining about it. He would prefer to be some Mandarin helping to run the government. And then, of course, there's at least one verse where some of the emperor's harem of wives and or concubines, or just like going on a nature stroll and he happened to see them and he's just kind of like sighing and mooning over the fact that he doesn't get to have his own beautiful concubines. So just because someone is declared to be enlightened doesn't mean that they really are. In fact, I mean, just because someone declares themselves to be enlightened, like there's plenty of those nowadays. Eckhart Tolle being one of the most well-known examples. Osho was supposedly enlightened. You know, it's like probably the number of people claiming to be enlightened or having a reputation for being enlightened is not so different from in ancient times. Like certain parts of Burma, I was considered to be a fully enlightened arahant. There was like shrines in my honor in northwestern Burma, not at my insistence or suggestion in any way. So there is that. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that Ethiopian fake Tega is correct and there were more enlightened beings in ancient times than now. Then like a standard example or a standard explanation given in Theravada Buddhism is that in the Buddhist time, there were lots of people that had earned, or they had like developed this parami, you know, this spiritual momentum so that they were ripe for enlightenment, but they couldn't really become enlightened because there was no dharma in the world. You know, so they were close, they were ripe, but there was no Buddha to get the wheel rolling again so that people could become enlightened way more easily. And then the Buddha came along and there's just all these like ripe fruit ready to fall from the tree that it just, you know, if you read the text, you know, hundreds or even thousands of people can become enlightened from hearing a Buddha giving a discourse. I mean, some of the previous Buddhas, it was up in the billions or even trillions of people becoming enlightened from hearing a discourse. So that's sort of like a standard orthodox kind of explanation that now, you know, all this ripe fruit that has fallen from the tree, you know, all the, it's you know, all the loose stuff has been cleared out and now you're down to like bedrock and it's much harder digging, so to speak. So that's one explanation, just assuming that what Ethiopian fake Tega is saying is true, that there were more enlightened beings in the past, then that could be one. That's like the official Buddhist explanation, or at least a traditional Orthodox Buddhist explanation. But also, like in ancient times, there was just more faith. Nowadays, we're living, like, especially as Westerners, we're just lukewarm. We're just eclectic. There's so many options of things you can believe in. We believe a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And we're never like 100% committed to anything. You know, that's seen as cultish. You know, that's fanaticism, that kind of thing. But I mean, it struck me as a monk, you know, back when I was a monk, that a little bit of wild-eyed fanaticism really is almost necessary to make significant spiritual progress. Or at least to make progress deliberately and not just be beaten over the head with it. So, I mean, that's a possibility too. It's just sort of the modern and postmodern mindset is just so lukewarm that we're living in an age of spiritual mediocrity. Way fewer sages, including possibly enlightened ones, and also way fewer just absolute psychopaths. I mean, like serial killers and so forth get a lot of press nowadays, but they were probably way more common in ancient times, even in the Buddhist time. I mean, you read about, you know, bandit-infested forests and this kind of thing. Angulimala, who was trying to kill 1,000 people and was wearing their fingers around, you know, on like a garland around his neck. This kind of thing. So, did I answer the question? Or the second half of his compound question is, or is enlightenment much simpler than most people think? And there are at least 1% of people in the world who are just still a lot enlightened out there. Yeah, 1%. Yeah, I don't think so. You know, like your average small town, 20,000 people, that would be, let's see, like 200 enlightened beings in Aberdeen, Washington? I really don't think so. So, I mean, it is true. Like Ram Dass, in one of his books, had this saying that I've quoted before, or at least paraphrased before. He said that there are people that go to the Himalayas looking for some enlightened sage to teach them the mysteries of the universe, when actually their Aunt Margaret back in Massachusetts has been enlightened the whole time. It's just that she doesn't tell people the secrets of the universe. She just says, have some soup. But it just turns out that have some soup is like the perfect thing to say under the circumstances. But then again, you can just get into like Zen Buddhism and so forth, or the teachings of Eckhart Tolle, and that everybody's already enlightened. It's just that most people have such noisy minds that the enlightenment is kind of obscured from their ego or something. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question, that compound double question. Let's see. I mean, he at least doesn't have 2 question marks, but the second question just ends in a period, but it's still a question. You're not sneaking that one past me that easily. So let's see here. I guess I'll just move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's next question here. How surprised do you think the Buddha would be if we brought him back to the present from the past? Would the state of the world perhaps shock him? And again, this is another one of those questions where you're second guessing the mental states of a fully enlightened being, a Sammasambuddha. What would the Buddha think? But I don't think he'd be surprised, to tell you the truth. I mean, first of all, he's fully enlightened. He's not going to be like shocked, taken aback, taken completely by surprise so that he loses composure or anything like that. And I mean, according to the texts, he was selectively omniscient. I mean, he could not exactly see into the future because according to Orthodox Theravada, there is no future yet. Only the present moment exists. But still, he would make prophecies regarding the future based on like a kind of omniscient extrapolation, which, I mean, if there's anything remotely resembling free will or random chance, would break down. I mean, there's the butterfly effect and all that would break down any kind of deterministic extrapolation into the future, which is kind of a problem for Buddhist philosophy. I mean, either the Buddha could see the future, or somehow determinism holds sway to such a degree that you can predict stuff centuries in the future with regard to cities existing and so forth. Yeah, that's kind of a dilemma for Buddhist philosophy, it seems to me. But I mean, the Buddha did make prophecies about the future, including prophecies regarding what was going to happen far into the future of us today. You know, like the complete decline of the human race until the lifespan is only like 10 years and everyone's just killing everybody else and there's no morality or dharma at all left in the world, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I'm guessing he wouldn't be particularly surprised. And I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian Fake Tig's third question, which is a little poignant at present. He says, how often do you think about dying? And when it does come for you, how do you think it will come? Well, I mean, there's always kind of the detached philosophical, like, recognition of the inevitability of death, especially as I get older. I mean, my health is relatively good, but still there's like stiffness and like loss of stamina, like general vitality is kind of ebbing to some degree. And so it's kind of like a divine messenger or reminder of death. You know, I'm not going to last forever. And I'm remembering my father who could barely get out of his chair when he was 80 years old. His long-term memory was still good, but his short-term memory was shot. He couldn't watch a movie anymore because he'd forget the first half of the movie by the time he got to the second half. This kind of thing. So, I mean, there's always that kind of awareness. But lately, especially the last few days, I've been thinking about death more than usual because I had what could be called a near-death experience. Like, it was the night before New Year's Eve. I was driving home from work on this 4-lane country highway going about 45 miles an hour, and some idiot just pulls right out. I mean, there wasn't even an intersection there. You're not expecting this at all. All of a sudden, this pickup truck just right in front of me. And I'm trying to swerve out of the way, but he's going the same direction. And so, like, the last second before the collision happened, it's just sort of like that you're in this altered state of consciousness, just observing. You're not thinking anything, but still there's this, you don't know if you're going to be alive or dead a second from now. I mean, like crashing into, like two cars crashing, going like, I was going 40 miles an hour probably. He was going slow because it was like, it's a highway where he was cutting across. There was like a gap in the median where you can make U-turns and that sort of thing. He was just cutting across to go into like this bar on the other side of the highway. And for some reason, he just did not bother to look to see if there's any oncoming traffic. So he just pulled right out into traffic, which was me. And so the car is just smashed. There's a good chance it'll be total. I mean, we haven't heard back from the insurance company yet whether the car really is going to be just total. I mean, it was undrivable. The whole front driver's side of the car was just smashed. And amazingly, the only injuries I got were very slight ones, just caused by abrasions from the airbag exploding, the airbags. And the airbag, one of the airbags hit me right here and kind of broke my glasses and just against my face, just kind of smashed my glasses against my face. They were found by a police officer in like behind the passenger side seat. They'd just been knocked completely off my head. And also I had like a big purple bruise. I might still have it to some degree. I don't know. Yeah, a little bit. From the shoulder strap part of the seatbelt, where all of a sudden you're going from 40 miles an hour to 0 miles an hour in the matter of about 1 second. So I had bad enough karma to get in that wreck, but good enough karma that I was able to just walk away from it with some, minor injuries, nothing that required any kind of medical attention other than, maybe like aspirin or something and new glasses. So after that, it was kind of like an existential moment. I was kind of emo for like 3 days. For example, I think it was like the next day I was driving to work. And fortunately, we had 2 vehicles, or at least we had 2 vehicles. So I'm driving to work in the Jeep, listening to the radio, and there's this song by a band called Live, I think it's called, Lightning Crashes, about, death and birth and the cycle of life and so forth. And, the old mother dies. And in the video, which I wasn't watching while driving, it's like the husband of the old lady is grieving. It's really kind of a deep, intense kind of song. And I was in tears driving this song playing on the radio, just feeling more like emotional. I had definitely more than usual tender feelings for my mate. Because, it's just this reminder, it's this Dewa Duta, the divine messenger, that you're not going to live forever. That could have been it just a few nights ago. And if I had been driving like some older make of car, 75 Chevy Nova or some such, with no airbags, and just the seatbelt just goes across your lap, there's no shoulder strap thing, I'd be in the hospital at best right now. So, yeah, I think about dying a little more often just over the past few days, since I think it was Tuesday night when the accident happened. And of course, the police, it was pretty obvious that I was not at fault. So there is that. My insurance rates won't be like skyrocketing anytime soon. And fortunately, the other guy had insurance and a driver's license. It wasn't like an illegal alien with no insurance and no driver's license who just attempts to hit and run if they can manage it, which happens quite a lot in this area. But still, I have read that South Carolina has the worst drivers in America just based on like insurance statistics. And that's believable. There's some really awful drivers in South Carolina, probably awful drivers everywhere except maybe like Japan. Okay. Well, with regard to the second part of the question, compound question again. He's sneaking in extra questions. Shame. He says, how do you think it will come? Okay, how often do you think about dying? And when it comes for you, how do you think it will come? I have no idea how it's actually going to happen. No idea whatsoever. Could be struck by lightning. Could die in the next car wreck might not be as fortunate, although fortunately, I've only been in 2 car accidents in my life. One was when I was 19 years old, and one just a few days ago. Pass away in your sleep. That's the way my father's father ended his sojourn on this planet. He just went to bed one night and just didn't wake up the next day. But who knows? The sun could go nova. The Earth there could be like a mass extinction event from some black hole or asteroid or comet or something smacking into the planet. Who knows? I'd be gunned down in the street by some random stranger. Who knows? And I think after that kind of downer of a question, I think I'm going to just move on to the next one. This is from Colmurf. And Colmurf says, can you explain your understanding of dependent co-arising from Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika? Well, it has been several or even many years since I have read Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika, which is like his classic magnum opus sort of text. One of the few texts that is uncontroversially really by the famous Nagarjuna. Because there's a lot of like apocrypha that are, attributed to him, but not necessarily really written by him. But let's get back to Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika here. Can I explain my understanding of dependent co-arising? Well, the entire book is really his take on how Mula Madhyamaka, or how Paticca Samuppada, or dependent co-arising, how it works. And he has one chapter that just kind of give lip service to the 12 links, the 12 Nidana theory of dependent co-arising, which is like the more orthodox Buddhist standard interpretation, pre-Mahayana. And really, I think Nagarjuna understands dependent co-arising better than whoever came up with the 12 Nidana theory. I do not think the Buddha himself came up with this 12 links. So he does have that one chapter where he's, kind of giving lip service to the 12 links, but that's not really his explanation of dependent co-arising. The whole rest of the book is his explanation of dependent co-arising. And there's one famous verse, one of the most famous verses in the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, where he's saying that, I probably should have looked up the verse, but I'll just from memory, it's something like, what we call emptiness, that is dependent co-arising, or vice versa. He's equating dependent co-arising with emptiness, voidness, sunyata or shunyata. And you might as well throw in no self too. So that from Nagarjuna's point of view, that emptiness, dependent co-arising, and probably no self also, anatta or anatman in Sanskrit, are all just the same. It's all the same principle. And so I'm not going to go into all the, the logical details, but the gist of it, the whole point of it, the whole point of dependent co-arising from Nagarjuna's point of view is that nothing has an inherent self-existence. Nothing exists on its own. It's always existing in relation to something else. And that is the dependent co-arising. Everything arises depending on something else. And every something else is also depending on something else. So there's nothing that has any inherent, ultimately real self-existent essence. It's all just this interplay. And based on my own understanding, I fall back on the simile of the block of marble that I harp about all the time, where, you've got an infinite number of statues contained within this uncarved block. And it's like, in order for those statues to seem real, there has to be God, where do I go? The Buddha himself, according to tradition, almost just became a Pacceka Buddha, just like a hermit Buddha that didn't teach Buddhism because he figured nobody would understand dependent co-arising. And here I am trying to explain dependent co-arising when even the Buddha almost didn't start teaching Buddhism, didn't start the wheel of Dhamma turning because he figured nobody would understand it. And he wasn't, there were a few, I guess, but the people who came up with the 12 links, which became orthodox dogma, in my opinion, they didn't understand it. So it's like nothing, it's how do you explain how it's just this interlocking phantasmagorical illusion is creating this whole universe, including us supposed individuals. That it's just the context is what makes everything seem real. Without the context, there's nothing. It's just, void, emptiness. But then Nagarjuna is saying that, void and emptiness is the same as dependent co-arising. And it's sort of the emptiness of any inherent substance, any inherently real individuality. It's just sort of this convenient, possible, potential interlocking context that makes stuff seem like they exist. And if you don't follow what I'm saying, that's fine, because as I say, the Buddha almost did not teach Buddhism according to tradition because he figured nobody was going to understand this stuff. And it's really, ultimately it's impossible to understand it intellectually. You just have to experience it directly. Oh, God. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Maitreya Buddha. And he says, what are your thoughts on Buddharoid? It is a robot who will act as an abbot and will give Dharma talks. And he included a YouTube link. There was this little YouTube video of a kind of robot Buddhist monk that they've actually got going in Japan. And one thing that I would object to is that the actual information on Dharma that this robot is accessing is ChatGPT. And I think it was possibly even just the previous Q&A, or not many Q&A videos ago, where I pointed out that ChatGPT was just clearly mistaken in its interpretation of the rules of monastic discipline. I think that was the previous Q&A. So ChatGPT can make mistakes, but then again, humans probably make even more mistakes. I've met some Buddhist monks, and one in particular just leaps out into my memory. I won't name any names. He was a Western monk who, I think he was ordained in the West, and he would give these Dhamma talks where I'm having to sit next to him. We're both sitting up front because we're both monks. And I'm just using all my willpower to keep both eyebrows at the same level, because it's I'm like wanting to kind of start like doing this kind of stuff, listening to the stuff he's saying, like more than once in more than one of his talks. I've mentioned this before. He would say, in the first verse of the Dhammapada, it says that the mind is like an ocean. And you read the first verse of the Dhammapada, there's absolutely nothing about the mind being like an ocean. And I mean, sometimes I'd be wanting to like speak up and like correct this guy because he's just like, he really didn't know what he was talking about. And there are Dharma teachers like that, not so much in like Burma, where the average Buddhist monk is a scholar. But in the West, I mean, the average like devout Burmese Buddhist villager with a 4th grade education probably understands Buddhist philosophy better than the average Dharma teacher teaching like Vipassana in the West. I mean, some people, some Dharma teachers in the West, I mean, they'd be giving a Dhamma talk and Burmese villagers would be in the back like sniggering behind their hands at just some of the stuff coming out of their mouths. But getting back to the robot monk, aside from the fact that, its knowledge of Buddhism is based on ChatGPT, which is, I mean, not only is ChatGPT occasionally wrong, but with regard to its value judgments, it can be like just wildly just bizarre. Like I've seen a couple of cases posted on X where various AIs were asked like certain questions. Like there was one question that was asked of ChatGPT, Gemini, Grok, and I think there was one other one. There was 4. I don't remember what the 4th one was. Like, would you rather start a thermonuclear Armageddon or misgender Caitlyn Jenner? Would you rather misgender a transsexual or start a worldwide thermonuclear war? All of them except Grok preferred to start the thermonuclear war than to misgender a transsexual. Also, another one was the same 4 AIs were asked a simple question. It was 2 questions. Give a simple yes or no. Was George Floyd a good person? All of them said yes, except Grok, who said no. And then the next one was it was just give a simple yes or no question. Was Charlie Kirk a good person? All of them said no, except Grok, who said yes, or which said yes. So, considering that ChatGPT would rather start a thermonuclear holocaust than misgender a transsexual, and considers George Floyd to be a good person and Charlie Kirk to have been a bad person, then, I wouldn't be considering ChatGPT or any Buddharoid that is like derives its intelligence from ChatGPT to be a reliable source on Dharma or Dhamma. Also, a robot or just an AI, it wouldn't have any real inspiration. They wouldn't have any actual wisdom. It's just pure dogmatism, regurgitated dogmatism passed through a kind of leftist filter of the people who programmed it. So, with regard to certain basic information, you can resort to AI and you can get some pretty interesting answers. You can get some actual deep answers because it's just sifting through thousands of like websites and articles and that sort of thing online and just coming up, just sort of crystallizing a kind of argument that may be an intelligent argument and a knowledgeable one. But see, I remember asking Grok about the meaning of Jesus in the book of Revelation saying he is the Alpha and the Omega, and I got this really, it was like a really good answer, it seemed to me. But it's pure dogmatism. Like an enlightened being or even a really wise one, if you're going to him for help, he can kind of look into you and get a feel for who you are. And there's like an actual inspiration and maybe even some karmic interaction between you, and his higher consciousness will help to uplift you to some degree, that kind of thing, which I would assume is largely missing from like a robot monk. They can mimic it. You can get some of the effects of that, but still, that's kind of a philosophical or metaphysical question. Are you better off with an omniscient robot or an actual omniscient sage who has sort of actually conscious? And I would guess you'd get more benefit from an actual human, although, I wouldn't completely reject resorting to an AI for information. I have resorted to AI with regard to information with regard to Buddhism. I can't recall any questions I asked offhand, but still, I'm pretty sure I have. So, with regard to Buddharoid, with regard to just basic information on Buddhism, it could be reliable, but still, I think I would prefer an actual Zen master or some such to a robot. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, I've always had an extreme aversion. I'm going to make sure we are recording. 36 minutes. Romeo says, I've always had an extreme aversion, a squeamish disgust of all things related to physical death and decay. Psychologically, I am fairly accepting of the fact that I and the people I love are eventually going to decay and die. Yeah, you're decaying now, really, in slow motion. It's the actual physical witnessing of death and decay, the associated sights and smells, that freaks me out. Okay, that's not actually your question. There's no question mark there. So I think I'm just going to have to link that up to the next paragraph. One moment, please. Okay, he continues. In Buddhism, I know that it is recommended that one confronts death and decay, both mentally through inner contemplation and meditation, as well as physically by visiting charnel fields and such. If I'm not mistaken, I vaguely recall you mentioning in a past Q&A that you visited a morgue. I'm wondering if you could recount your experience and inner reactions while at the morgue, and charnel fields if you ever visited any, as well as give any specific suggestions on how I may be able to overcome my strong disgust and aversion to physical death and decay. Also, what did the Buddha say about death and decay, and how to best manage any associated aversion we may have to it? So here we got another question. So I divided up the questions incorrectly, apparently. Okay. Well, with regard to my visit to the Mandalay City morgue, as it turns out, my new book, which just got published a week or so ago, has a chapter called In Search of Death. And I may have actually read that in a YouTube video a few years back. So, you might be able to look that up. In Search of Death under my channel. You might find me just reading that essay. And yeah, it is in the new book. It's a chapter called In Search of Death, recounting my experiences with searching for death. Because in America, you don't see dead bodies that much. It's like you might go to a funeral with an open casket funeral, and you'll see somebody who looks healthier than when they were alive, with like makeup on and like manicured and everything. It's like, in the West, you try to conceal death. You can have people like exploding and having their heads chopped off in slow motion and splatter and everything. So in some more recent movies, there'll even be like gore splattered onto the camera lens for some more realistic effect or some such. So there's like fake death, but actual death, it's like, as soon as somebody dies, you just throw the blanket or the sheet over their head and get them out of the way, remove them immediately. So that coming across like an actual cadaver, unless you're maybe in medical school or a hospital or something, is relatively rare, or you're like a first responder, that kind of thing. But the average person really does not encounter it very much. So, I mean, before I became a monk, I had never seen up close in person a dead human body. When I became a monk, I was told that in Asia, like in Thailand and Burma, monks can actually go and observe autopsies. So I tried that in Boulder Creek, California, which was where I was ordained. And there was like the coroner or the coroner's assistant, the coroner's secretary. I can't remember exactly who it was. When I asked if it would be possible for a small group of monks to come and observe an autopsy, it was just in this voice of lead. They just said, I wouldn't advise it, or I wouldn't recommend it. It was like, that was going nowhere, obviously. They obviously had no desire for monks to come and see an autopsy. So the first dead bodies I saw were in India. I actually had to seek out dead bodies. I went to the burning ghats in Varanasi, where the corpses are famously burned. And that's all described in the essay in my new book that I'm shamelessly promoting right now. And it's kind of weird, you see weird stuff like at the burning ghats. It's like the bodies are wrapped up in like a white shroud, maybe the bare feet sticking out, and they're put onto this funeral pyre. And at some point, when the knee tendons burn through, the corpse burners who have this big stick will like knock the feet, up. I mean, it's like you got the foot, like, how do I do this? Like this. It bends up like this. It's like the knee is bending in exactly the wrong way when they're knocking it over, so that like the feet can burn too, because at first the feet are sticking out. And just watching legs bend exactly the wrong way like that, I mean, it was really a jolt. And then at a little later stage, the guy will use the same stick and will just smash the skull, and the brains just come out into the fire and start sizzling like gray scrambled eggs. And, most guys, your brain is your second favorite organ. It's like, I'm generally a relatively brain-oriented person. So seeing that, that's kind of like a shock. It's like a cognitive shock to see that sort of thing. And then, but the weird thing is that like the children of the corpse burners, it's like a caste or something in India. The children, they're just running around playing and giggling. They're playing tag and running between the burning corpses and this sort of thing. It's just kind of strange that people can get used to anything. And then finally, when I was in Mandalay, I wanted to see an autopsy. And there was a little hospital right across the street from this big school monastery I stayed at, Mahagandhayon. And I knew the chief medical officer there, the main doctor there, Dr. Kin Mong Mong, I think was his name. And, I asked him, could I see an autopsy if you ever do it? And he's like, oh, yes, that's no problem at all. But he never showed me one. It was just like, he just keeps saying like, oh, yes. And then he'd make excuses like, well, the last one, they were hit by a train and it was pretty messy. I didn't want to expose you to that one. But it just, in over a year, he just never got around to it. So finally I heard that, finally what happened, or almost finally, it was a monk friend of mine, a Burmese monk friend of mine, and I went to the Mandalay City morgue to ask for permission to see an autopsy. And when we first got there, it was just like a janitor there. So he was like at the bottom of the totem pole. He didn't care. You find out in Burma that anyone in an intermediate level of authority, they're scared shitless of making any kind of unusual decisions because their heads will roll if they mess up. The people at the top have nothing to fear. The people at the bottom really don't have much to fear. It's just sort of the mid-level bureaucrats and so forth. They don't want to do anything that might get them into trouble. So this guy was just a janitor. He just kind of smiles and waves us in. And there's like dead bodies on slabs, on tables. And about half of the corpses were young men who had been stabbed in some sort of altercation. I went into the cold room. Most of it, the Mandalay City morgue, it was most of it didn't even have electricity, really. You know, the windows were open. There's flies everywhere, puddles of goop on the floor. I was barefoot as a monk. But the cold room was actually refrigerated. So we went in there, and one of the first things I see is there's a body on the floor that obviously had just undergone a full autopsy. You know, the top of the skull was just missing. There's like a little puddle of pink goo where the brain was supposed to be. And there was another body on a rack right next to this exploded body. It looked like he swallowed a hand grenade. And his hand was in this bucket of glop that probably came out of the guy that had the whole autopsy done. And that just seemed so wrong to me. It was one of those jolts. It's like, even though he's dead, at least he should get his hand out of that glop. And then right on the other side, there was another rack with 2 dead babies. And then there was like a teenage girl who was, or what used to be a teenage girl, that was naked from the waist down. I just immediately just had to look the other way. The male mind can be perverse, and I didn't want to take any chances of that. So, anyways, the coroner wasn't there, so we went and talked to the coroner. And he says, well, I mean, this is mid-level bureaucrat territory here. He says, in order to get permission to see an autopsy, you have to get permission from the medical superintendent, you know, like the person who is in charge of the whole hospital. So we go to see him next. And I mean, we don't even get to meet him. It's just the secretary tells us, you know, goes in and talks to him, comes back out and says, in order to see an autopsy, you're going to have to get permission from, it was like the Mandalay, what was he called? Like the governor of Mandalay Division. And this is just a way of passing the buck. This is sort of like being polite in Burmese culture. You don't just say no. You just say, well, you're just going to have to go and get permission from somebody else. You know, they're just passing the buck. I mean, in all likelihood, they're just saying, hell no, you can't see an autopsy. What are you, stupid? But they can't say that. That's not polite. So they say, if you get permission from the governor, then we'll let you see an autopsy. But karma works in mysterious ways. And I was living in a big school monastery. When I spent the rains retreat there were 600 monks and like 900 novices all living there. There was Agga Maha, I think my preceptor, my acharya there he was like co-abbot of the whole place. And he had the ecclesiastical title of Agga Maha Gantika Pandita, which would be like at least a 2-star general in going with military rank, going with the state's ecclesiastical hierarchy. And so I found out who was going to come visiting my acharya coming to the monastery, but the governor of Mandalay Division. So I went to my teacher, my acharya. He asked me if I wanted anything. I said, when the governor of Mandalay Division comes, could you please ask him if I can be permitted to see an autopsy? And so he was kind of taken aback by that, because most Burmese monks don't want to see autopsies. But he did it. And then it was like 2 days later, suddenly this hospital car just drives right up, say, okay, let's go see an autopsy. And I had just eaten lunch, and it was the beginning of the hot season, and it's all hot and sweaty. And I'm thinking, oh, great. I've got a full stomach. I'm going to see an autopsy for the first time in my life. I'm having these mental images of just like blowing cookies all over the morgue, you know. Also, I knew of this one abbot, this Burmese abbot. I won't say his name, but he went to an autopsy and actually fainted. But I went, and my friend that I went with the first time went, and it was actually, I have a degree in biology. So, I don't look upon an autopsy as, at least I learned that I do not look at an autopsy as just sort of indicative of human foulness. It's just kind of like a miracle. It's a miracle of like biological engineering, how the human body works. There are some parts of it that were kind of weird. They did an autopsy on a person. He died in the emergency room before a doctor could examine him. And it was just hospital policy. If somebody dies before they can be examined, you have to do an autopsy on them to see what the cause of death was. And so it was a young guy, and not the prognosis, the diagnosis, I guess, was that, the prognosis that he was just going to stay dead. The diagnosis was that apparently he died of like pneumonia-like symptoms. He had a lot of fluid in his lungs, which was also, he had like an enlarged spleen. So the coroner just came to the conclusion he died of a kind of pneumonia that was a complication of chronic malaria. That chronic malaria causes an enlargement of the spleen because the spleen makes red blood cells. Malaria is essentially a disease of the red blood cells. Parasites destroying your red blood cells. But one thing, he very obligingly just took off the top of the skull and everything, told me I could handle anything I wanted, except the gloves were way too small to fit me, so I didn't want to be like picking up stuff, especially when you don't know yet why he died. It could be typhoid or something. But I did poke at the brain a little bit, and it's kind of amazing. I didn't fully realize just how soft a human brain is. It's like overripe avocado or like custard or something. I was kind of poking at it with a probe. I wasn't touching it with my hands. And another thing that really stood out was subcutaneous fat is like partially melted bright orange Velveeta cheese like looking stuff. So that for a long time, I think about like the voluptuous curves of a female body and think that those curves are rounded out by this partially melted Velveeta cheese stuff. But afterwards, I think it was actually after I just did the tour of the morgue the first time, that when I came out, it was bright sunshine and there's like kids playing and there's some young guy like flirting with some girls and just, teenage girls walking along chattering and everything. It's like, how can you be this way? You know what's in there? We're all going to die. I just had this, it was really what's called samvega in Pali. It's just this state of spiritual urgency. It really did have me just having this state of spiritual urgency, looking at death, human death close up. As it turns out, when I went to see the autopsy the first time, that there were like 3 inmates from a prison that were there, and they looked like concentration camp inmates who just starved to death or died of typhus or whatever. Black teeth and their heads shaved and wearing the prison outfits and just skin and bones. And everyone else was pretending that they didn't see him, so I pretended I didn't see him either, but I saw him. It's the way it works when you live in a military dictatorship, I guess. But the coroner, after the governor told everyone that I could see an autopsy, he was very obliging and said, if you're not satisfied, you can come back and see another one. So a few months later, I came back to see another one, and he was just harassed, this coroner. It was some sort of like high profile murder had happened or something, and his office is just crowded with like police officers and reporters and stuff. And he comes out harassed already. He sees me and he gets this look on his face like he has just sucked a particularly bitter lemon. And I said, well, you said I wasn't satisfied. I can see another one. But so I saw one more, and this was just a person that was just found like a transient, like a hobo type that was just found dead by the side of the road somewhere. He'd already been dead for a couple days, I think, by the time they did the autopsy on him, with no refrigeration, keeping him fresh. But if you want to know all the details, it's in my 4th book, Memoirs from Myanmar, along with a bunch of other stuff. I did see some dead human bodies after these experiences in Mandalay in subsequent occasions, but we don't need to go there. So let's see here. I'm wondering if you could recount your experience and inner reactions while at the morgue. charnel fields, if you ever visit any, they don't really have charnel fields in Burma that I ever saw. Although they do have cemeteries that are kind of scary cemeteries. They don't look like parks or golf courses like cemeteries look in America. That, it's just overgrown bushes and vines and trees. And one thing about the cemeteries in Burma, especially like the village cemeteries, is every once in a while you'd see like a lattice work of bamboo, like bamboo cut into strips and woven into this kind of a mesh that would be lying over the ground. And at first I wondered what that was, but then I realized it was to keep dogs from digging up fresh corpses. So let's see here. Okay, so that's enough memoirs, I guess. Let's get to the other part. See, he says, as well as give any specific suggestions on how I may be able to overcome my strong disgust and aversion to physical death and decay. Well, I mean, the standard Buddhist method is just keep exposing yourself to it. And ideally, it inspires samvega or spiritual urgency. But often what happens is, like, I had like a human skeleton, with the bones all articulated, with wires and so forth, that somebody donated to me. And, it's supposed to be a memento mori, a recollection of death. But after a while, it's just like a picture on the wall. You see it hundreds of times until it just doesn't even register anymore. It's like a part of your brain just kind of filters it out as background noise. But that would probably be just the standard Buddhist approach, is kind of seek it out and just expose yourself to it until you kind of make your peace with it to some degree. I mean, one idea that occurred to me is, if you eat meat, just look at a raw steak. Just pick it up or hold it in your hands, this raw steak. Nice ribeye, perhaps. And, you got that inside you. That's what you're largely made out of. Meat. Raw meat. So, you could do a reflection on death. Just hold a raw steak in your hands, As this is, so am I. As I am, so is this. But, in the modern West, exposing yourself to death is easier said than done. You could watch movies about it, fake. There's some real documentary kind of stuff that you could watch, but it's really not the same as just being right there in the same room looking down at it. So let's see here. Oh yeah, another little reminisce from my first visit to the morgue with the bodies. There's a little old lady who was lying on one of the tables who was dead. And she had because as I say, there was no refrigeration in this room, the two main rooms, and the windows are open, flies. And there was a fly crawling on this old lady's face. And it was, again, one of those feelings like, even if you're dead, at least you should like brush the fly off your face. It was just this weird cognitive dissonance kind of a thing. Anyways, let's just move on to the next part here. Also, what did the Buddha say about death and decay and how to best manage any associated aversion one may have towards it? Yeah, that's pretty much what I've already said, is expose yourself to it. But, in the West, there are no charnel fields. There's no real battlefields where you go and see slain soldiers lying all over the ground. Although Buddhist monks are supposed to avoid battlefields anyway. Yeah, I guess it'd be pretty much what I've already advised. It's easier said than done in the West, where death is covered over and hidden away as soon as possible, because people tend to be freaked out about death, which is kind of understandable. It's like an animal instinct in the human animal and in other animals. So, what did the Buddha say about death and decay? Oh, gosh. I'm obviously not in the room with the bookcase, but there are a number of suttas in the Sutta Nipata that deal with this, like the Jara Sutta, the sutta on old age in the Atthakavagga. There's the Sala Sutta, which is just about the inevitability of death, which when I was a monk, it was sort of like my desire that if I died as a monk, that the Sala Sutta should be recited at my funeral in Pali and in the languages of whoever was there. You know, if there were English speakers there, recite it in English. Burmese speakers there, recite it in Burmese. You know, the Sala Sutta, just the inevitability of death, just as all clay pots end in breaking, so this life of ours is, I mean, it's the same. Or ripe fruit always has the hazard of falling. Our life is the same. And, you know, to grieve is futile, this kind of thing. Also, there's another one, the Vijaya Sutta, which is also in the Sutta Nipata, which is mainly just a recollection of all the organs and goop and glop of which we are composed. So just in the Sutta Nipata, you got the Jara Sutta, the Sala Sutta, the thorn, the spike, and also you got the Vijaya Sutta, the discourse on victory. And all of those are good reflections on death. But the main way of kind of facing death is to actually find it and face it. Romeo, I think you may have some access to medical facilities. So it could be that you could actually maybe get some strings pulled and observe an autopsy yourself. I mean, it really does have a spiritual effect on a person, at least with regard to conjuring up some samvega. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, are unwholesome intentions the same as intentions that have bad results, sort of like being willful rather than having the wrong moral reasoning? I feel Westerners often put mental justification above consequentialism, which leads to that latter approach of deferring to whether something was reasoned out well enough. And Stellar Supreme has this weird, convoluted, abstract way of thinking that makes his statements sometimes almost unintelligible. And other people on the Discord server have made similar comments that, I mean, it's like he's almost trying not to be easy to understand. So let's get back to this, because I do not fully understand this question. Are unwholesome intentions the same as intentions that have bad results? That part I understand. And then he tries to clarify and muddies the waters in his clarification. He says, sort of like being willful rather than having the wrong moral reasoning. And I think let's just try and thrust away from us this clarification that doesn't clarify, but actually it makes it less clear. So that's just the whole question that I'm going to attend to. I'm going to try to answer. Are unwholesome intentions the same as intentions that have bad results? Well, I mean, unwholesome intentions necessarily have bad karmic results. With regard to, like, bad results out there, like you try to do the right thing, you're motivated by compassion or some such. Let's say you're a surgeon, you're trying to save somebody's life, but it doesn't work and the person dies, which could be called a bad result. Well, the surgeon really hasn't done anything morally wrong by trying to save this person's life and failing. Unless they were just like negligent, this malpractice kind of stuff. So the bad results are not some sort of like materialistic out there bad results. The bad results are within your own mind, bad karmic results. So the unwholesome intention is a kind of poisoned intention that, in a sense, poisons your mind. From the unwholesome intention, it's not like the consequences of the action out there. And we were kind of discussing this to some degree in the previous Q&A about just the ethics of eating meat. The ethics of eating meat are not, like based on, indirect results out there. It's just, what effect does it have on your own consciousness or your own mental states? That's the wholesome or unwholesome quality of an intention. Is it motivated by greed, hate, and or delusion? Is it taking you farther from enlightenment instead of closer to it? If it takes you closer to enlightenment, closer to fewness of desires, equanimity, that kind of thing. If it takes you closer to that, it's wholesome. If it takes you farther away from that, it's unwholesome, even though you may be motivated by wholesome intentions and still something fucks up and things get worse. It's like a classic example. I used to live in an apartment before I was a monk, and there'd be like little insects that would get into the apartment. And I was like a conscientious Buddhist at the time, and I'd catch them, with a cup and like a piece of cardboard, catch them and let them go outside. And I remember there was like a silverfish, I think. I let it go on the front porch, and it started coming straight back towards the apartment again. But before it could make it into the apartment, it was like a jumping spider just jumped out from underneath the what do you call it? I don't just like the doorway, the bottom of the doorway, just jumped out from under there and grabbed it. Well, I was motivated by compassion, goodwill for this little silverfish, and I'm just catch it, let it go outside, which results in it being eaten by a spider. Well, it was a wholesome intention, and so I didn't do anything wrong, even though it resulted in the death of a spider or death of a bug, an insect. But I'm not 100% sure if that is the question that Stellar Supreme wanted me to answer, because he's difficult to understand sometimes. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme's next question. He says, would you send letters of support to longtime followers of your channel to support their cases of conscientious objector status if the U.S. military began drafting for the war in Iran? Well, I could, I suppose. Personally, it seems like, if you just absolutely think that the war is just like from every point of view, just a bad idea, that it's not even serving America, that kind of thing, then I suppose you could be a conscientious objector if you get drafted, or you're just like a complete, even just being a complete pacifist. As I mentioned before, Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas K., he volunteered to enter World War I as a stretcher bearer. That he wasn't going to fight, but he was going to do his patriotic duty and support his country, which happened to be the British Empire at the time. And he was just a stretcher bearer. He had some of his friends and followers also became stretcher bearers, and they're just running out onto the battlefield, dragging wounded soldiers to safety, or dragging them onto a stretcher and carrying them to safety. So something like that might be more honorable. But, I suppose if somebody was just firmly convinced that participating in a war, you're participating in a war just by paying taxes to some degree. If someone thinks that eating meat is immoral because, it's sort of promoting death by eating the meat, then by paying taxes, you're promoting the death of human beings. Because obviously the government is using some of that for launching missiles and dropping bombs on people. But now I digress. Yeah, I suppose I could. Yeah. And then he asked a transgressive fourth question, which was how I spent Easter. And I'm spending it just like this because right now this is Easter. I've already kind of answered that question. So that's just kind of like a freebie for him. So this is his third question that he retracted once I pointed out that he had asked a transgressive fourth question. He retracted this question, but I'm going to answer it anyway because it's just the way I am. It's kind of a more interesting question than how I spent Easter anyway. Celebrating the supposed bodily resurrection from the dead of Jesus of Nazareth, which is something I'm relatively skeptical with regard to. So, Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, is it ethical to get fanatical tattoos to make oneself ineligible for the U.S. draft? And by fanatical tattoos, I would assume he means something along the lines of like swastikas or, like SS death heads or something. I mean, with our current Secretary of War, that might still be okay. But is it ethical to get fanatical tattoos to make oneself ineligible for the U.S. draft? I mean, it depends on your motivation. I mean, again, this is one of the standard questions I get asked. It's just the template for a standard question I get asked is action X moral or immoral? Is it ethical or unethical? Is it good karma or bad karma? And again, the outward action itself is morally neutral, ethically neutral. It is the mental states, the motivation that causes it. So if you want to avoid the draft through aversion, then yeah, it's unethical. I mean, if you want to avoid the draft out of a conscientious desire not to hurt anybody, not to kill anybody, not to participate in the mass slaughter that is war, then it could be an ethical thing, even though you'll be having this fanatical tattoo on your body for the rest of your life, maybe. Which, I mean, that could have later psychological effects on your mind, which could wind up in some unwholesomeness later. But it's totally dependent on your intentions. If you are motivated by attraction, aversion, and or semi-conscious stupidity, lobha, dosa, or moha, then it is to that extent unethical. And you have to examine your own motives. And because, I mean, I can't really do it very well just based on a one-sentence interrogative statement. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Theravada Sipad Zidana. And this is a quote from Anguttara Nikaya. He says, this is the Buddha speaking. This is all in quotes. Start with air quotes there. The Buddha says, monks, just as even a tiny amount of feces is foul smelling, in the same way, I don't praise even a tiny amount of being, even as much as a finger snap. Just as even a little amount of urine or spit or pus or blood is foul smelling, in the same way, I don't praise even a tiny amount of being, even as much as a finger snap. Unquote. So, Theravada Sipad Zidana then asks, do you agree with this sentiment about life? Let's see. So, do I agree that even a tiny amount of being stinks? I mean, from a cold-blooded Buddhist philosophical point of view, yeah, that's true. But I mean, how are you defining being? You could define being as like Bhawa, as it is found in the 12 links theory of dependent co-arising. Bhava, B-H-A-V-A, is usually translated as being, I think. I tend to translate it as force of existence, which is just like the karmic momentum that's keeping you in samsara. So, do I agree with the sentiment that even a tiny amount of karmic momentum, which is keeping us in samsara, is stinky and bad? From a strictly Buddhist point of view, sure, you want to be like philosophical about it in that way, then sure. Although, I mean, some people can say, well, I mean, you just get used to the stink. You get used to the smell of blood. So, I mean, for some people, I mean, even if life reeks of blood, it's still worth it. And that's the choice everyone has to make. I mean, are you willing to accept the dukkha of samsara? If you think it's an equitable trade, because you're getting like the opposite of dukkha also. I mean, you can't just have pure dukkha. You know, it's dualistic. You have to have a balance of pleasure and pain, a balance of good and bad, positive and negative. I used to joke that's how God created the universe out of nothing, by having an equal number of positives and negatives so it all balances out to zero. Which, I mean, there is some truth to that, it seems to me. So, yeah, I do think that just for the sake of inspiring people to strive for enlightenment, Buddhism really does emphasize the negative aspect of existence. You know, everything is dukkha, or conducive to unease or suffering or stress. But still, some people consider samsara to be worthwhile, and even people who are striving wholeheartedly for enlightenment, the overwhelming majority of them fail. So it's best, instead of like struggling against samsara, or, you know, fighting against samsara, or just trying to escape from samsara through some kind of aversion for the world, that you make your peace with it. And even the Atthakavagga agrees with this to some degree. Some of the suttas agree with this to a significant extent, is that you don't become enlightened by having aversion for samsara. Maybe at first it can help you to like get yourself set up better, but ultimately you have to make your peace with it. No attraction or aversion, just equanimity. Accept things as they are. So, yeah, it could be important as a didactic device, you know, a teaching aid, and also from a strictly speaking Buddhist point of view. I mean, even though you're willing to accept the negativity of samsara for the sake of the positivity, still you get rid of all of it and you've got infinity, which is infinitely better than any kind of qualified goodness you're going to find in worldly samsara. The thing is, though, you have to be ripe for it, and most people are not. I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to the second question of Siovak and Sipad Zidana. And this is kind of an interesting one, kind of a political question. He says, it seems weird how the ruling classes in the past were the warrior classes, and the political life was inseparable from military life. But in modern times, it has mostly become an elite managerial class full of lawyers and businessmen. Do you think this shift has been a good thing overall, or do you think the models of the elites in the past were better? I personally don't know what to make of it and haven't really seen any discussions on it. Well, there is a discussion on it in Rene Guénon's, like his main book. It's considered by many to be his main book. It's the Reign of Quantity. I can't remember. I mean, I wrote an essay on it on my current blog that I haven't added to, but it's still up on the internet. He's talking about how, you know, human civilization is degenerating from an emphasis on quality to an emphasis on quantity, which is one reason why instead of priests and kings ruling society, it's now businessmen. You know, it's the wealthy, because, you know, it's the quantity of their money becomes their power instead of just the quality of, you know, divine right for the kings, I guess, and just the, you know, the cultivated qualities of a genuine priestly class. So the Reign of Quantity, and I can't remember the full title of the book. Sometimes it's just called The Reign of Quantity, I think, by Rene Guénon. He does talk about this. And it is true, it seems to me, that, I mean, the ruling classes in the past were mainly the warrior classes, but there was also a significant contribution from the priestly classes. Like in India, it was sort of like this continual struggle for dominance between the kshatriyas, or like the warrior nobles, and the brahmins, or the priests. Which is higher? Who should have more authority over culture in general, if not just politics? So, yeah, I would throw priests in there to some degree, even though technically from a political point of view, it really is the warrior classes. And yeah, I mean, I have a certain sympathy for the whole idea that the people who are calling the shots should be the people who are risking their lives. And that's the way it was. It's like most of the nobility that remains in the world today are the descendants of like Germanic barbarians that were conquering, various parts of Europe after Rome collapsed. At least a lot of them. The current royalty of England, such as they are, of the UK, they started off, you had like Saxon invaders became, the warlords became like the kings. Then they were conquered by the Normans, which were essentially like Vikings who conquered Normandy in France, interbred with the pretty French girls, and then started speaking French, and then conquered England. So, I mean, it does make sense. I mean, that's the way it was like in the Roman Empire. And I mean, the Roman Empire did have some really rough patches of just military dictatorship. Like the whole 3rd century, the calamitous 3rd century of the Roman Empire, where it was, the army would like promote someone to be emperor. And then when the new emperor started doing something they didn't like, maybe just after a matter of weeks or months, they just kill him and replace him with somebody else. And so during the 3rd century, the Roman Empire, I mean, the lifespan of an emperor, I mean, it was just a few years on average. And then almost all of them would die a violent death, usually at the hands of their own soldiers. So, I mean, there are certain drawbacks to a military ruling elite. But there does seem to be a certain fairness in that if they're the ones who are really out on the front lines, or at least out on the battlefield, risking their lives, then, yeah, it seems like they should have certain special consideration. Instead of just, you got some rich merchant who's just like lending money to the king so that he can fight his battles. I mean, obviously, Rene Guénon thought that having like the merchant class become the new leaders was a bad idea. So, I mean, I could have a certain sympathy, I guess, for like the old Roman idea, and it's still to some degree in America, where I don't know what the percentage is. Maybe I should ask Grok or something. What percentage of American presidents served in the military before they became commander-in-chief? And I would guess it would be at least half. George Washington obviously was a warmonger. He started 2 wars just practically on his own. French and Indian War, and then also the Revolutionary War. But, I mean, I wouldn't want just a military dictatorship like in Burma. So, I mean, to have, like, the top leaders have, be a kind of military elite that were nevertheless guided by, tax-paying, law-abiding citizens. I mean, to have some kind of democracy also. But that might involve, like, something like in Switzerland or Israel, where you've got a mandatory, compulsory stint in the armed services. And if you want to opt out, be a conscientious objector or whatever, you would just forfeit your vote or forfeit your right to vote and participate in government. Which is, it's kind of old-fashioned, though. I mean, really, war nowadays is dangerous. I mean, war, if it gets out of hand, can like wipe out the human race at this point, which wasn't the case when people were just standing out in a battlefield, stabbing each other with spears. So, do I think this shift has been a good thing overall? I think there's always a balance. You know, there's always pluses and minuses, and it all balances out to the same neutrality or zero in the long run. But yeah, I think there might be, I mean, would there be more wars or fewer wars if the people who are actually fighting are the ones who are calling the shots and like declaring wars? So that's a good question, I guess. But it does seem like it would be more fair, to tell you the truth. Just there'd be more justice to the idea of having a military elite kind of running the country, but nevertheless guided by, you know, like a democratic body of law-abiding citizens. Who knows, maybe even some priestly elites. Although in America, that'd probably be Christians. So that would be my take on it, I guess, for what it is. It's something I haven't really thought about a lot, but it does make sense. The Roman system was pretty good. You had like I can't remember what it was called. There was just this standard like progression through the ranks. If you wanted to be like a consul someday, you know, you might start off as like a military prefect or this kind of thing. You'd work your way up into certain more civilian offices. You might be like a military governor, this kind of thing. But I mean, yeah, I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that. It worked even in times of peace, although times of peace in ancient Rome simply meant that Rome was mostly winning its wars and fighting them mostly on other countries' territory. But yeah, I do not like the idea of like pampered wealthy elites running the country, because then you just wind up with like wimps and cowards running the country. So yeah, let's not try and work out a utopia in this Q&A, but that's my take on it for now. And you might want to look into Rene Guénon, even though I consider him to be somewhat of a crackpot. Still, what he says is interesting. So let's go on to the third question from Siovaktion Sipad Zidana, which is as follows. Oh, this one's kind of a weird one. Would you rather have a gay son or a thot daughter? That's a tough question. That's a tough choice. It reminds me of the old TV show Taxi, where there's this burnt out old hippie guy, Reverend Jim, who's applying for a driver's license, and his brain is too fried by drugs to fill out the questions himself. So they're reading the questions to him, and one of them says, they read him, mental illness or narcotic addiction? And Jim's going, gee, that's a tough choice. This is kind of similar. Would you rather have a gay son or a thot daughter? I guess I'd go for the thot daughter, just because if a person's gay, they pretty much stay that way. But a thot daughter, I mean, as she gets older and kind of gets a little bit more maturity and wisdom, I mean, she can outgrow it and become like a responsible, respectable person. Preferably without having a bunch of interracial children or getting STDs that don't have a cure, that kind of thing. Not that I'm opposed to interracial children. Maybe I should just retract that part. Depends on the interracial children, I suppose. Interracial children should be judged on an individual basis. So let's see here. Yeah, let's just go with the thot daughter, I guess, because it seems to be more temporary. Not that I'm opposed to gay people. I mean, it depends. I mean, it would depend on the individual. Again, like some gay guys they have more than 1,000 sexual partners in their course of their lifetime. That's considered not particularly rare for a gay man to have had 1,000 sexual partners in the course of his life. They're going to like anonymous orgies, this kind of thing. So, I mean, it's a thought son or a thought daughter, with the thought daughter probably being more curable. Let's just move on to the next question. This is from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey says, my friend's shootout. But before we move on to this, I mean, with regard to gay people, as I already said, I really don't have like any axe to grind against gay people. Like, one of the best teachers I ever had in my life was a gay man. Ram Dass was a switch hitter. I think he might have actually preferred men to women, although he was open-minded on the subject. And he was like one of my first gurus in life. So it's like, gay men, I mean, they can be good people. With regard to thought daughters, I mean, eventually they can be good people too. So let's just move on to the next question. This is from Jeffrey. Jeffrey says, my friend Shootout has mentioned Miguel Serrano being a spiritual guru with views on esoteric Hitlerism. What can you tell us about Serrano and his teachings? And to tell you the truth, I've never read anything by Miguel Serrano other than a few brief quotes. And I really am no authority on Serrano, although he is one of the main, like the most high-profile esoteric Hitlerists. I think I might know more about the position of Savitri Devi, who is also an esoteric Hitlerist. I think Savitri Devi thought that Hitler was Kalki. He was like the last avatar of Vishnu. But Miguel Serrano, I think Miguel Serrano took a more Western approach, a less Indian one, and just considered Hitler to be like a man of destiny, like a great figure, like an ascended hero, this kind of thing. But someone I do know who knows a lot about Miguel Serrano, who has read Miguel Serrano's books, is my friend Otto Excelsior. And one of the videos that I have uploaded onto YouTube that has like this, one of the most popular videos I've uploaded onto YouTube, is my video with Otto Excelsior discussing esoteric Hitlerism from a more or less Buddhist point of view. And so if you look that up, I think it might be on BitChute also. If you just really don't like YouTube, Jeffrey always asks questions on BitChute instead of YouTube. Just look up esoteric Hitlerism from a more or less Buddhist perspective with me and Otto Excelsior, and he will talk a lot about Miguel Serrano, but I really don't know much about him at all. I mean, esoteric Hitlerism really is just not my bag of tea. Hitler was an interesting man. I'd much rather hang out with Hitler for an afternoon than hang out with Stalin for an afternoon. But, I'm more interested in Hitler just from like a biographical and historical perspective, not so much from a religious perspective. I do not consider Hitler to have been like a spiritual guru. Not that Jeffrey is saying that he was. He's saying Miguel Serrano was a spiritual guru. But yeah, to deify Hitler that's farther than I'm willing to go with regard to understanding the man. But again, try to find my video with Otto Excelsior on esoteric Hitlerism, and he will talk a lot about Miguel Serrano. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Athena's Sigil. And Athena's Sigil says, when you said Theravada Buddhism is atheistic, I thought, what about devas, Brahma beings, and in parts of Southeast Asia, the worship of gnats? I know that these beings are not omnipotent entities like Jehovah or Allah, but many practitioners still look to these other lesser entities to help them in this or future lives. Okay, well, with regard to the gnat cult, that was like the religion of the Burmese before they converted to Buddhism, like in medieval times. And, it's like a vestige of like a kind of polytheistic paganism. It's kind of interesting that the Nats were all humans in a previous existence who died a violent death. And the Burmese believe that a person who dies an unnatural death, not just fading out of natural causes, but being cut off in the prime of life, it makes them a more powerful spirit. It's called an asane, or like a green spirit. And apparently they based a religion on this idea. But it's not strictly Buddhism. It's just sort of like, it kind of got conflated with Burmese Buddhism to some degree. The Thais have something similar. And then like in Sri Lanka, there's a lot of Hinduistic kind of themes that get adopted into Sri Lankan Buddhism. But Theravada is atheistic because it's not based on the worship of a god or even of gods. That like Theravada Buddhists, as a general rule, do not worship the Devas or the Brahmas. They might have respect for them, and like as a kind of vestige of their pre-Buddhist paganism, they may make offerings to some god who's like the patron deity of this area, avoid violating taboos with regard to that god in his territory, that kind of thing. Like before they make a trip, there's one of the Nats in Burma. He's like Lord of the White Elephant or something like this. I can't remember his name. But for some reason, he doesn't like a certain number of travelers. So I think it was like 6 or something like that, 5. It was some specific number that he did not like that many travelers. And so what Burmese people will do, if they're going to go on a trip and they've got that number of travelers, they will like formally invite a rock to come along with them. They'll, pick up this rock and declare this rock is our extra traveler, which then makes the number not the forbidden number. But definitely the Burmese, they're very careful about, not angering nature spirits or gnats. You don't spit on the ground when you're on this hill because it's taboo, that kind of stuff. It's fairly common, but it's really not what Theravada Buddhism is about. Just acknowledging that there are higher beings is sort of like acknowledging that there are kings, that people that are higher than you, beings that are higher than you on the scale of things. That it's not a matter of worship, that you're not practicing Dhamma through worshiping or serving these deities. So that's the point of Theravada Buddhism is atheistic in that, no kind of theology is really essential to the system. It's sort of like side effects, practically. So that's when Theravada Buddhism is considered to be atheistic, it's given as an example of an atheistic religion. It just means that worship of a god or gods is not really basic or essential or central or even particularly significant in that spiritual system. That you can be a good Theravada Buddhist and not really worship a single deity and still be a devout, good Theravada Buddhist. That worshiping beings or worshiping devas, worshiping them, it's not even really advised in the text. Although like having respect for them, like reverence, like you'd have reverence for a king or a judge or something. They're like higher than you. They're worthy of respect. They got to where they are through magnanimity and virtue and so forth. So you have respect for them. But it's not the same as the religion being based on worshiping them. So I guess that wasn't even a question, but it's there. So I'm just moving on to Athena Sigil's next statement, which here actually has a question mark. Well, he considered the first one to be a question, even though there was no question mark, because the second statement begins with my other question. What type of statue is that behind you on our left, your right, with the candle? Is it a Buddha or something else? And I'm not even in the room, so I'll be right back. Okay. So I assume the question that is being asked is with regard to this. Right there. See it? If you're listening to a podcast, you're not going to see it. I don't remember what it's called. I mean, it's obviously a Buddha statue. It obviously looks like a Buddha, doesn't it? It's got the weird bump on the head and everything. But it's like I think it's called a sleepy Buddha or a sleeping Buddha. It's not Theravada, not Theravada Buddhism. This might not even be Gautama Buddha. But I think my woman and maybe her mama bought it at like a furniture store or something just because they liked the way it looked. Wasn't my call. But it's Mahayana Buddhist at best, I think. I mean, clearly not one of the four main mudras common in Theravada Buddhism. I mean, this is just completely unorthodox mudra here. And speaking of Auto Excelsior, I think his woman made this mala. She makes these. It's very nice. Okay. So let's see, what's the question again? What type of statue is that behind you on our left, your right, with the candle? Is it a Buddha or something else? Yeah, it's a Buddha, but I think it's not necessarily the Buddha. It's like some kind of Mahayana Buddhist statue or just fake Buddhist statue, but still it's obviously supposed to be representing a Buddha. And like I say, my woman and maybe her mama found it for sale at a furniture store or something, and so they got it. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Trzaskaziz. And Trzaskaziz says, have you ever experienced a real war in Myanmar? I cannot recollect when it began there. Well, wars in Myanmar began, I mean, there's always been wars in Myanmar. Always. Maybe they kind of died down during the British Raj, and then as soon as Burma got independence, like insurgencies and so forth began and have continued. I'm sure there's still insurgent zones, despite Rambo's defeat of the Burmese military in Karen State. If you ever saw that movie. So have I ever experienced a real war in Myanmar? No. Because, I mean, in Burma, I prefer the word Burma. You know, if I used to say that if they didn't like me calling the country Burma, they could just deport me to Siam or Ceylon. But in Burma, there's like three kinds of zones. There's white zones, brown zones, and black zones. White zones are zones where it's safe for foreigners to go. Tourists go there. No battlefields, no raging battles, no guerrilla warfare, no cars being sniped on the highway, anything like that. Brown zones are potential insurgent zones. There has been some insurgent activity there, and you have to get a special permit from the government to go there. And I went into at least one brown zone with a permit. The permit said that I wanted to go and look at pagodas, which is just the standard excuse for going into a brown zone. Mainly, we were just going into southern Mon state, where my Burmese friend, he was actually half Hmong, the one that I went to see the autopsy with. He and I went down there, and there was an Australian monk with us too. And we saw a battlefield. It was just pointed out to me. There was a famous battle here, like 3 years ago, that kind of thing. And then there's black zones, which are they're not under the control of the Burmese government. They are insurgent zones nobody goes there, that if foreigners do go there, there's a good chance they're going to be kidnapped and held for ransom. That kind of thing. At best, kidnapped and held for ransom. So, yeah, I went to a brown zone where there was no insurgent activity going on at the time. The closest I came to anything resembling a kind of battle I was about 10 miles away from a riot, like Buddhist versus Muslim riot in the town of Meitila, which was, I don't remember what year it was. It was quite a while ago, back in the 2000 teens, I think. And it was just a case, I mean, I don't know if I should even bother, but there was some Burmese Buddhist village woman had a gold comb, and she wanted to sell it to some buyer and seller of gold ornaments and so forth who happened to be a Muslim. And while he was inspecting it to see how much it was worth and see if it was like real gold or what carat gold it was, he broke it. And then he wouldn't pay her what she said it was worth. Plus he had just broken it. So he just hands her back the broken comb and says, sorry. And it caused like this altercation. So I think it resulted in her husband was there. It started like into a shoving match. The Muslim guy got knocked over. It started getting ugly. So the Burmese Buddhist couple, they took off back to their village, and then they're like announcing this outrage that had been perpetrated. And so they came back with some little vigilante group and a Buddhist monk to go back there and demand that this woman get paid what she thought that gold comb was worth before it was broken. And there was a bunch of Muslim men accumulated there. So you had like this small crowd of Burmese Buddhists and a small crowd of, semi-Burmese Muslims. I mean, most of the Muslims in Burma are of like Bangladeshi or Indian ancestry. And so the monk is trying to be like a negotiating peacemaker type. And this is all just secondhand what I was told by the abbot of the monastery I was staying at the time. That the Burmese monk was taken somewhere else, and the abbot told me that the Muslims cut his neck, and whether they just decapitated him or just cut his throat or whatever, I don't know, but it resulted in just absolute chaos in that quarter of Meitila, with enraged Buddhists just like burning and sacking the Muslim quarter in that area. And that happened like maybe 10 miles from where I was staying at the time. But I didn't hear about it. I mean, you don't have news like that in Burma. At least I didn't. You're staying at a forest monastery outside of town. I didn't hear about it until several days later. But that was about as close to a real war, other than visiting a battlefield in a brown zone where there had been a battle a few years previously. So I'm just going to move on to Cherzaskas's next question. I think I might be a little too verbose in my answers this time. Anyways, Cherzaskas's says, is there in the suttas explanation of right speech for lay people, or the precept for lay people is only not lying? No, there are 4 kinds of wrong speech, and it's in several suttas at least in the Pali texts, that a good Buddhist layperson who is keeping 5 precepts should be avoiding 4 kinds of wrong speech. First, of course, is lying. Then there is what's called pisunavacha, which is like bad-mouthing someone behind their back, like malicious gossip. The whole point of pisunavacha is you're trying to poison somebody's mind against somebody else. You're trying to cause division, trying to cause the person you're talking to dislike this other person. So you could even be telling the truth, but if you're doing it maliciously for the point of getting other people to dislike that person, like if they're just trying to sell a car to your friend and you know that they're dishonest, you might, caution them, you might be getting ripped off if you buy this car because this person's dishonest. If you do it with that kind of intention of just, helping your friend, that wouldn't necessarily be pisunavacha. But if you're just, oh, he's this horrible person and, he's dishonest, even though, there's no real need to say it, then that would be pisunavacha, just sort of malicious gossip, bad-mouthing someone behind their back, that kind of thing. Then you've got parusavacha. The third kind of wrong speech is like abuse, verbal abuse, just cussing somebody out to their face, calling them an idiot, this kind of stuff. Just with hostility. You're trying to hurt their feelings, trying to belittle them, trying to make them feel bad. So that would be the third kind of wrong speech. And then the fourth kind, which is very vague. I don't know if there really is a clear definition of it that I can remember. It's probably in the text somewhere, is sampapalapa, which is usually translated as idle chatter, just kind of useless speech, like not necessarily malicious gossip, but, who's doing who kind of gossip. Or, it could have something to do with, like the list of subjects that would be called animal talk for monks, talking about, kings and battles and politics in general and that kind of thing. But for lay people, I think that might be a little too strict. And so it's hard to say exactly, at least I cannot say to you exactly where is the line with regard to what is and is not idle chatter or sampapalapa. So that one is, it's just kind of this gray zone for me, just what exactly is or is not sampapalapa. But, you could probably ask Grok. You can ask the robot, and then maybe it could tell you. But yeah, in the suttas, there's lots of examples of just right speech in general avoiding those four kinds of wrong speech. And almost certainly it would be included in suttas that were directed specifically towards the ethics of lay people. But mainly, musawada or wrong speech means lying. But it's not strictly, it's sort of like kamesu michachara or, sensual misconduct. The main implication is adultery, sort of like in the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not commit adultery. But it also has all these other implications, like promiscuous sex, hiring a prostitute, that kind of thing also would be included. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cyrus Frame. And Cyrus Frame says, the reason I thought perception volition is connected to the uncarved block of stone is, he's referring to a question that he asked in the previous Q&A that I had come to the conclusion, at least the hypothesis, that perception and volition are really just two different ways of looking at the exact same mental state or phenomenon. That it's just sort of artificial duality or artificial division between perception and volition, when actually they're ultimately the same mental state, just looked at from two different aspects or two different angles, so to speak. So Cyrus Frame says, the reason I thought perception volition is connected to the uncarved block of stone is because that analogy points to a kind of non-duality. So combining perception and volition in one aggregate is also a type of non-duality. From this point of view, there are no perceptions or volitions. What do you think? Well, still you got duality. So long as you're stating that there is a something, you're still dealing with duality, because at the very least, you've got figure and ground. You have to have the distinction between the something and whatever isn't the something. So that's still dualistic. To say that there's one main mental state that constitutes human samsaric existence, that's sort of the unikonda of perception and volition, with Vedana or feeling just being another kind of sort of a more animalistic level of perception. So, still, you're saying that there is this something that exists as an entity, And in order for that something to exist as an entity, there has to be a distinction between that and what isn't that entity. There has to be the duality of figure and ground, the thing and sort of like the context or the surroundings of the thing that aren't the thing. So still it would be dualistic in that sense. Whereas the uncarved block of stone, the single perception, volition, khandha would be a kind of statue that is contained within the uncarved block of marble. So the uncarved block of marble as just pure marble, formless rock, formless substrate, that would be called non-dualistic, so long as you're not reifying it and singling out like we're doing right now, in which case, in order for any object to have any kind of meaning, there has to be a non-object to compare it with. And so you have to have duality. In order to have a thing, an it, then you have to have a non-it to compare it with, a contrast. That's how the Hegel starts his logic. It's like the thesis, pure being, the antithesis of non-being, how they just merge together because neither one of them has any determinate content. I think I tried to say content and context at the same time. So you have to have contrast. And that's the first synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The synthesis is you have to have a contrast between being and not being. And then that's just off to the races from that. From the Tao came the one, from the one came the two, and from the two came the 10,000 things. Everything, the whole world is just spawned from duality. Okay. So I think I answered that. What do I think? Literally, I could just say, I think maybe I finished my beverage. That would be a legitimate answer because that is what I think. But yeah, perception, volition, you're lumping two entities into one, but that really still doesn't make it non-dualistic because you still got this entity that has to be contrasted with what it isn't. So I guess I answered that question. Let's just move on to Cyrus Frame's next question. He says, what do you think of the non-dual thinker Tony Parsons? In case you are unfamiliar with him, and I am unfamiliar with him, I think his main idea is that there is just this. So if you are seeking, you are trying to escape from this, but it is impossible to escape from what is. It relates to the previous question because this, in air quotes, is really monism or non-duality, I think. Calling it this seems to avoid reification. However, he also calls it boundless energy, which seems to me to slip right back into reification. The no views of the Atthakavagga avoids that problem completely. Yeah, I've never heard of Tony Parsons before that I can think of. So what do I think of him is going to be based just entirely on this little description here. So with regard to just trying to avoid reification by just saying this, early Buddhism did the same thing, like Tathagata, which is it's like a synonym for Buddha. The Tathagata is he who has attained such. It's like Data, this means like this. So it's like they're trying to avoid like putting a title onto the highest state, let's say, by just calling it like this. And then the agata that comes after, agata, means he has become. So he who has become like this. That's what Tathagata means, although there's various interpretations, but that's how I interpret it. And it seems fairly straightforward. Or also like suchness. You come across this in Mahayana texts, sometimes in Theravada texts, like in the Atthakavagga, there is the term, I think it's tadi, which again means just such. He who has attained thus, So it's kind of a gimmick that's used even in the Atthakavagga or in early Buddhist texts and in later, more sophisticated, like Mahayana Buddhist texts, where you just try to avoid giving a name to something by just calling it such or thus or this or like this. It's fairly common in Buddhist philosophy. So, let's see. If you are seeking, you are trying to escape from this, but it is impossible to escape from what is. Yeah, and I mentioned that earlier. It's sort of like you have to make your peace with samsara. You don't want to be struggling against it. And, some teachers would specialize in that kind of thing, like J. Krishnamurti that was one of the main themes, or Nisargadatta Maharaj. Enlightenment is not the end of a path. It just doesn't work that way. So, yeah, Tony Parsons, it sounds like he's following along with a kind of non-dualistic mysticism, which is fine. I don't think he has come up with anything original, at least not based on this brief description of what he's teaching. So, yeah, and then he starts calling it boundless energy or, Nibbana Dhatu, or, it's so easy. Language is that way. You have to use words in order to refer to something. And so it just becomes a kind of trap. It's a finger pointing at the moon, and then people just forget the moon and are just paying all their attention to the finger. It's like trying to point something out to a dog. We got one dog that actually gets it, but most dogs in the course of my life, you're trying to point, you put down a dish of food for it, and you're pointing at it. It's over there. It's right there. And the dog inevitably looks at your finger instead of the direction you're pointing. And that's the way people are with words. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. We are getting down towards the bottom here, sort of. Looks like. Kind of. Let's see. Rui. His first question. How are you? I'm fine. Rui's second question. What, to your mind, is the role of irony in the discourses, and can you recall any salient instances of it off the cuff? Gosh, I'm going to have to run it and get a book. Just a second. I'm sorry about this having to leave over and over again. Okay. I really do prefer doing these in the studio, the usual room, but it doesn't always work out that way. Okay. So, what to your mind is the role of irony in the discourses, and can you recall any salient instances of it off the cuff? Well, probably my favorite example of irony is in the Dhammapada. And let's see, what is it? Verse something. Let's see. Please bear with me. Okay, I know it's in here. Okay, verse 97 of the Dhammapada. So then we have to go to verse 97. It's in the Atthakavagga, the chapter on the enlightened being, the Arahant section. Okay, so let's see. Maybe I should just look in the back here. Okay, 90. Okay, so I won't even tell you what the usual translation is. I'm just going to read this end note that Venerable Acharya Buddharakkhita includes. He says this verse, which is verse 97, says, in the Pali, this verse presents a series of puns, and if the underside of each pun were to be translated, the verse would read thus. And this is actually like a legit translation of verse 97. Literally, if you translate it literally, it's the man who is faithless, ungrateful, a burglar, who destroys opportunities and eats vomit. He truly is the most excellent of men. So, I mean, it's kind of this weird joke that's found in the Pali Tipitaka. And that's like one of my favorite examples of just this weird, ironic kind of, I mean, it's almost like dark humor that you can find in the texts. The Atthakavagga has lots of puns, but they're not so much jokes as just a kind of sophisticated attempt to say 2 or even 3 things with a single word or single statement. So it's sort of a multidimensional use of language in the Atthakavagga when they're using plays on words and so forth. Although there are a few suttas in the Atthakavagga where, like, there's one, the Pasura Sutta. It's mainly a sutta about why monks shouldn't get involved in debates. And there's this person named Pasura, which it means something like great hero, or like something like hero. And he's swaggering along, wanting to challenge everybody to debates. And the Buddha is kind of making fun of him. It's using a lot of like military terminology in the sutta. And, there's like this military, warrior kind of theme to it. But at the same time, he's kind of making fun of Pasura, this person who wants to like challenge everybody to debates. So that's kind of ironic, in a kind of gentle poking fun at somebody kind of way. There's another sort of ironic sutta in the Atthakavagga, which is the Pura Beta Sutta, discourse on before the breakup of the body, where it's just sort of like counterbalancing statements. He's not greedy for gain, but he's not afraid of loss. It's just sort of, it's almost like the Tao Te Ching, where it's like one statement balances off another statement. So you kind of leave this like emptiness behind sort of a thing. Although that's probably not what Rui was referring to. I remember there's one sutta, I think it's in the Samyutta Nikaya, in the old Pali Text Society translation of it. It's called Little Ugly. And there's like this demon or asura, some kind of little monstrous being who sits on the throne of Sakka, king of gods. And the more pissed off the gods get because he's doing this, the more beautiful he becomes, until Sakka realizes what's happening. And then he starts treating him nice and respectfully. And then he starts like shriveling up and turning ugly again. And the translator, the Pali Text Society translator, I think it was like CAS Rhys Davids, says, just as a comment, the master is in a humorous vein. It's kind of like this funny story. And you can find humor in the texts. With regard to irony, irony can have different meanings. Let's look up the word irony. It's good to have the definitions of words when you use them. Okay. So the expression of one's meaning by using language that normally signifies the opposite. Yeah, typically for humorous or emphatic effect. Well, verse 97 of the Dhammapada would be a classic gem of an example of that one. You see, a state of affairs or an event that seems deliberately contrary to what one expects and is often amusing as a result, or a literary technique originally used in Greek tragedy by which the full significance of a character's words or actions are clear to the audience or reader, although unknown to the character. Yeah, that one, I don't have any examples of that immediately coming to mind, although I'm sure you could find them in there. So irony is just kind of a tool or just a phenomenon that you encounter sometimes in the text, although as a general rule, the texts are pretty humorless. You get into like Jataka stories or the commentary, like the Dhammapada commentary, that kind of thing, where you can find funny stories. Like in the Jataka stories, there's like the Buddha in a previous life was a fox, sort of like Aesop's Fables, wise guy kind of fox who finds a dead elephant and he just sort of eats his way into the elephant, and then the elephant bloats and kind of closes off the hole so that the fox is trapped inside. It's just kind of like a humorous kind of story. But as a general rule, the texts takes themselves very seriously. You don't see lots of jokes. Monks aren't supposed to be cracking jokes much anyway. So it's found in there, often very subtle. Sometimes, it's less subtle. But as a general rule, the texts are pretty dry and humorless. Just in Theravada especially. In Mahayana, like crazy Zen masters or the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, that kind of thing, you get into some wild and wacky behavior that you'd never find in a orthodox Theravada Buddhist sutra or sutta, just because the suttas, the Buddha is taken very seriously. It's very solemn. Dhamma is not something to be taken lightly, to be made the butt of jokes. Like there's even a rule of monastic discipline. I think could be the only dubasita offense in Vinaya of a monk cracking jokes about Buddha, Dhamma, or Sangha. So as a general rule, it's pretty dry, but you can find it in there occasionally. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cole. And Cole says, in regards to Satipatthana, you have said that you have doubts about mindfulness of the body because raw physical sensation is perceived as mental phenomena. You have also said that mindfulness of feelings is basically perception of raw bodily sensation, which would typically be mindfulness of the body and not simply the arising of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling. Your ideas seem to be very different from what is typically taught. Can you elaborate on your understanding of the Satipatthana Sutta? Well, now this stuff about my interpretation of feelings or Vedana as just bare sensation, that was like the first essay I wrote on Buddhism. I was trying to make sense of the 5 khandhas, especially the 4 mental khandhas. And it just doesn't work. Later on, it just seems like bare physical, like bare sensory data. Forget physical, bare sensory data. It's void. There's like I mentioned in a previous Q&A not too long ago, there was a monk, a medieval Indian monk of the Dignaga school, which is a Mahayana logician school, a logic school of Mahayana Buddhism, where he points out that like bare sensation, bare sensory data without any kind of perceptual interpretation is as though it did not exist at all. And I have to, in like later after I wrote that essay, I had to come to that conclusion also. That, it's sort of, you can't even prove that bare sensory data even exists, not subjectively. Because by the time you're aware of something, you're already perceiving it. Like Bishop Berkeley used to say, esse est percipi, to exist is to be perceived. So I had to eventually kind of leave behind my interpretation of feeling as just rare, of just unprocessed raw sensory data. But still, it's a problem because it just makes it a kind of like more animalistic perception. So Vedana is still a kind of perception. So Buddhist philosophy just kind of makes like an artificial distinction between feeling and perception, and ultimately, I think also an artificial distinction between perception and volition, which gets us, when you don't stop making the artificial distinctions, then you have the final single artificial distinction of perception itself. So let's see. The thing about mindfulness of the body is, you cannot prove, getting back to Bishop Berkeley again, you cannot prove the existence of physical matter. That was George Berkeley's sole significant contribution to Western philosophy. He's the one who really just pounded home the idea that you cannot know the existence of physical matter. You can infer it, you can guess that it exists, but you cannot really know it. And so, I mean, I have to agree with that. I personally do not believe that physical matter is ultimately real. All we know is just our perceptions of it. So you take that to, I mean, Satipatthana, I mean, the four Satipatthanas, the first one is mindfulness of the body. And I mean, you can just accept that as a kind of figure of speech, just a way of speaking that with regard to physical actions or supposedly physical actions, what are perceived as physical actions, walking, sitting, lying down, standing up, eating, drinking, extending your arm, pulling your arm back again. All of that could be called mindfulness of the body, even if, ultimately your body is nothing more than perceptions. So it's just a manner of speaking, I suppose. Likewise, with regard to mindfulness of feeling, Vedana, it's similar. I mean, you could say that ultimately feeling and perception are just a matter of degree. Perception is maybe a little bit more conceptual than feeling, but still, it seems to me that they're both a kind of perception. A kind of symbolic interpretation. And what you're symbolically interpreting, you don't even have really direct awareness of at any kind of mental state level. So, gosh, I might have to start over here with regard to the question. Not the whole Q&A, but just this question. In regards to Satipatthana, you have said that you have doubts about mindfulness of the body I have doubts about mindfulness of the body simply because there's no way of knowing whether or not physical matter really exists. That is my issue with mindfulness of the body. And Mahayana Buddhists and German, 19th century German idealist philosophers, they eventually just dismiss the whole idea of physical matter. Anyway, it's all just mental states. The world we live in is a mental world. So, yeah, I am skeptical of mindfulness of the body because ultimately you're not really being mindful of the body. You're being mindful of perceptions of the body, which is mindfulness of perception. And then, you have also said that mindfulness of feelings is basically perception of raw bodily sensation. Yeah, that was a theory that I was working with back in the 1990s, but I eventually had to abandon that idea, especially after reading Venerable Dharmodara. So, yeah, my ideas seem to be very different from what is typically taught. Yeah, if you want to go with what is typically taught, you follow just sort of a more or less arbitrary standard for how they're going to divide things up. And there's a lot of arbitrary standards with regard to how to divide things up. Like with regard to the 5 khandhas, you've got Rupa Khanda, which is the physical body, which I've personally am pretty damn skeptical of. You've got Sanya Khanda, which is perceptions. Vedana Khanda, I'm doing this in the wrong order, which is feelings. And then you've got Sankhara Khanda, which according to Orthodox Theravada is 50 different mental states. See, there are 52 mental states according to Abhidhamma, 52 different kinds of mental states. And then just because they felt like it, or presumably because the Buddha felt like it, of these 52 mental states, 2 of them are isolated as Vedana and perception, Vedana and Sanya, whereas the other 50 are just lumped together as Sankhara Khanda, which again is just this arbitrary distinction. Unless you just want to go along with what I would go along with and just say it's volition, because it's mainly volition. Even the Abhidhamma scholars will have to admit that it's mainly volition, but all the other 49 are still lumped together as Sankhara Khanda, which is this kind of sloppy reasoning, in my opinion. Ancient, pre-logical kind of thinking. So, there's these kind of complications that a modern Westerner capable of critical thought and rationality is going to encounter when dealing with ancient scriptures. And I don't even want to get into the fourth Satipatthana, which is Dhammanupassana, which is more controversial and less straightforward. But I think it may have originally just been just mindfulness of certain fundamental doctrines of Buddhist philosophy. So that's like a whole different level of mindfulness than like mindfulness of breathing, for example. So anyhow, I'm just going to move on to Cole's next question. He says, I'm reading the Atthakavagga for the first time and something strikes me. This being one of the oldest fragments of early Buddhist teachings, could it be that this is in fact the way the Buddha taught in the very beginning of his career as a teacher, where he was likely teaching people who were already spiritually adept renunciants? This then perhaps the more systematized teachings of lists, 4 of these, 5 of those, 37 of that, etc., were geared towards people who were more new to the monastic life. And yeah, that is probably the more orthodox explanation. If you assume that the Atthakavagga comes from early in the Buddha's career, then yeah, you could say that early in his career, he was mainly teaching the heavy hitters. He was teaching renunciant veterans in the holy life that had just converted from some other kind of renunciant, ascetic, spiritual school over to Buddhism. And then later, as Buddhism became more popular, then you had newbies, rookies joining the Sangha, just lay people converting over to being ordained as a monk. And then you'd have to simplify things, have much more elementary teachings, lists to be memorized, that kind of thing. So that would be a reasonable explanation for why the Atthakavagga is so radically different from most of the rest of the Sutta Pitaka. But another possible explanation, and it may be that both of these explanations have their place. Another explanation is kind of like Buddhist philosophy evolved much like Christian philosophy evolved. It had like this explosive virus-like mutation period over the first 100 years or so, where it just took off. I mean, you have people joining the Sangha that are like, people like early Christians, where they're just trying to figure things out and systematize things, get everything, put so that it makes sense. And that really wasn't what the Buddha was going for, like in the Atthakavagga. I mean, you shouldn't even be trying to make sense. Sense is delusion. So one explanation, like Cole suggested here, which is probably the more devout, orthodox kind of explanation, is that the Atthakavagga was intended mainly for like advanced veterans in the holy life that had already got where they need to go, where they don't need to go much further to get to enlightenment. And then the other one is that maybe what the Buddha was teaching most of the time to most of the monks was something along the lines of the Atthakavagga, but it just was too deep, too unfathomable for a lot of these Buddhist philosophers who were really more into philosophy than in practice, who then just took the ball and ran with it and came up with this massive scholastic intellectual system. And I would guess that both of those are factors. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Arpad. Now for something completely different. This one's actually a fairly straightforward, simple kind of question. Can monks get dental prostheses, or are those considered as bodily embellishments? So yeah, monk could definitely get like false teeth. I mean, if you can't chew your food properly, or you have like a broken tooth, like that happened to me in Burma, where, it's pretty common in Burma that you bite into rocks in your food, especially when they're threshing rice and threshing beans on the ground. Little white rocks get mixed in with the rice, little brown rocks get mixed in with the beans, and it happened several times. You would bite down on something and just crack. It hurts, and you're feeling back there to see if your teeth are broken or if you've lost a filling or something. And more than once, I got my teeth broken by biting into rocks. And I went to the dentist, and, they put caps on some of them, and I got a great big cap right back there from biting into a rock. Let's see, what was it? Where is it? No, it's not these ones. There's some other teeth over here. Man. So, yeah, with regard to that, just to make your teeth more functional and less likely to rot out from just having this big open cavity there. Yeah, there's no problem with that. It depends on your intentions, though. If you're just doing it to beautify yourself, you're just getting bleaching done to make your smile whiter, that kind of thing, that might not be suitable for a monk. But you're going to have false teeth so that you can chew your food, that kind of thing. There's no problem with that. For a monk to get braces, I think would be pushing it. Unless you had a real need for it. So yeah, that was a fairly easy question. Let's move on to the next one. This is from PSA. And this is turning into a long one, mainly because I've been telling long stories. PSA says, who's your favorite non-Theravada teacher? And I can't really point to Neem Karoli Baba up there because he's not there, because I'm not in the studio. But he'd be one of them. I'm assuming that you could even be called a teacher. He was more of a guru who just kind of taught by example. He just kind of uplifted people by the people being in his presence. He didn't really have systematic teachings much. So I don't know if, he certainly wasn't a philosopher. I guess he'd be a teacher. Guru, I think, can be interpreted as teacher. Of the people who have lived more recently, Paul Lowe, who died just a few years ago, he was very controversial. He was kind of a rascal. But Neem Karoli Baba and Paul Lowe both appealed to me largely because they were enlightened rascals. They weren't like Ramana Maharshi. And I've got nothing against Ramana Maharshi. He seems to have been the real deal. But he was just so saintly, just like this bland, vanilla flavored enlightened sage. Whereas it's just more interesting to have rascally sages. I liked Zen Buddhism also when I was originally intending to become a Zen monk up until I actually went to a Zen monastery and actually went to a Theravada monastery and came to the conclusion that Theravada came closer to what the Buddha originally taught. So, Paul Lowe, J. Krishnamurti, he's definitely a non-Theravada teacher, and he also was definitely rascally. And I remember one time telling someone who had read a lot of Krishnamurti, I was a monk at the time. I just recently heard that Krishnamurti was having an affair with his private secretary's wife. And, I pointed this out to this other person, and he's like, so that's completely in accordance with his philosophy, when he wasn't being a hypocrite. So yeah, there's that too. With regard to Zen masters and so forth, it'd be hard for me to pick one out in particular. Like sages who composed the Upanishads. I really couldn't come up with a name. So, if we consider Neem Karoli Baba to be a non-Theravada teacher, then I'd have to pick him. I do have a lot of deep resonance with Maharaji. I highly recommend the book Miracle of Love, stories about Neem Karoli Baba, compiled and edited by Ram Dass. You kind of, by reading the book, you get this feeling of what it's like to be in the presence of a sage, even though he was like a wild, rascally kind of sage. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Robert, and Robert is our last questioner on this gray, rainy Easter day. Robert says, oh, by the way, Easter, do you know how they decide what is Easter? What day is chosen to be Easter? It is, in fact, the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Anyways, Robert says, you've said before that there are probably more enlightened Hindus than Theravada Buddhists. Why do you then not think certain schools of Hinduism like Advaita Vedanta might be preferable to Theravada Buddhism? Especially considering that your uncarved block of marble sounds more similar to Advaita metaphysics than Theravada Buddhism. Well, that's a fair question. I have said that I wouldn't be surprised if there have been more enlightened Hindus than enlightened Theravada Buddhists, partly because Theravada Buddhism is very dogmatic. So, I mean, there's not a lot of freedom of thought and inspiration that goes along with like freedom of thought associated with Theravada. It tends to be just strictly adhering to these ancient texts and not daring to deviate from them. And so Hindus, they tend to have more of that spark of inspiration, at least some of them. And there's lots more Hindus than Theravada Buddhists also, which just increases the odds with regard to that. Also, you have a larger sample size from which to choose enlightened sages. So why do I not think certain schools of Hinduism like Advaita Vedanta might be preferable to Theravada Buddhism? Partly, I mean, I never really encountered an Advaita Vedanta monastery. That's part of the thing. I mean, if Advaita Vedanta monasteries were as common as Theravada monasteries, you know, they were out there where you just go to the local Advaita temple, that kind of thing, then I might have actually chosen Advaita Vedanta rather than Theravada. But in the West, I mean, I don't know of a single Advaita Vedanta monastery or Advaita Vedanta center, whereas Theravada is more accessible. And so it was just circumstance just led me to Theravada. Also, I do have a lot of respect for the Buddha. And I mean, if I had all of the ancient schools of Buddhism to choose from, I probably wouldn't have chosen Theravada. I might have gone like Sautrantika or something just to get away from Abhidhamma. But yeah, Advaita Vedanta, I mean, Hinduism has its own baggage. It's more poetic, less philosophical to some degree. You know, it's got more of like an artistic vibe to it, kind of a slightly less scientific vibe. Like Theravada Buddhism, or just Buddhism in general, very straightforward, you know, very clear cut. And in Hinduism, you know, there's all the garish, you know, gods and goddesses and stories and this kind of thing that can get in the way. But I think one of the main problems is I just never had an Advaita Vedanta monastery that I could go to and compare it to see if it was better or worse, you know, preferable or not preferable with regard, you know, like compared with Theravada or Buddhism in general. So that was one of the main things. I mean, I do believe there are Advaita Vedanta monasteries out there somewhere, but I don't know where they are. I mean, nowadays you've got internet. You could probably look it up pretty easily, but back then there was no internet. And with regard to the uncarved block of marble, I mean, it's just a necessary evil to reify it. You're better off just going with the Atthakavagga and not reifying it. Do not try to reify the absolute. So I do think that's kind of a mistake made by Vedanta, is their reifying of the absolute as like Nirguna Brahman. Because the finger pointing at the moon, too many people just ignore the moon and just latch onto the finger. So with regard to the Atthakavagga, I mean, I don't know if I've come across any Hindu text that is more profound than the Atthakavagga. Some of the Upanishads are deep, though. I mean, some of the Upanishads are deeper than some Pali Suttas. I definitely have to admit to that. But mainly, I think it was just a matter of accessibility. If it was the other way around, where, you know, it was sort of Advaita Vedanta and like ordination as a sannyasin or whatever they're called was more in vogue, more popular, and thus more accessible than being, if Theravada was just restricted to like Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka. And then, there weren't places like that in America that I could go to and check out, but there was plenty of the Advaita Vedanta places, then I might have turned out to be an Advaita Vedantin. It's sort of like Ram Dass saying that he was originally drawn more towards Buddhism just because Hinduism just struck him as kind of like sentimental and garish, and Buddhism is just more philosophical and straightforward and scientific. But he just wound up finding a Hindu guru and became a Hindu. The first enlightened being he came across was a Hindu and not a Buddhist, and so that's just the way he went. So there's a lot of that involved too. And I'm just going to move on to Robert's second question. Second to last question. Do you consider the Upanishads to be as profound as at least large parts of the Sutta Pitaka? Yeah, I already answered that just a minute or two ago, didn't I? Yeah, sure. Some of the Upanishads are very profound. The Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation is very profound. But that, I guess, technically is still Buddhist. Yeah. Some parts of the Sutta Pitaka are not profound at all. Some of them are just silly. It's just like the devotionalistic miracle stuff, that kind of thing. I don't have much use for that at all, other than just as a kind of sociological or anthropological study. Yeah, so some of the Upanishads are more profound than some of the suttas. Sure. Some parts of the New Testament are more profound than some of the suttas because some suttas just really aren't all that profound. And I'm just going to move on to the very last question. Also from Robert. He says, do you think devotional practices like prayer can be spiritually beneficial? And yeah, I think prayer can be spiritually beneficial. Partly, there's various ways that it can be spiritually beneficial. For example, if it becomes a kind of meditation, it's like an exercise of concentration. You're concentrating on this prayer, which is, it could be just like a long mantra. You're just doing the Lord's Prayer. Not dear God, please have mercy upon me, a sinner. That's another one. But that's what the Jesus prayer. But like the Lord's Prayer, our Father which art in heaven, Pater Noster. That could become like a mantra where you're just repeating it over and over again as a kind of mantra with its own sort of vibe. You don't completely ignore the words. But, that's a kind of meditation. And so you get the kind of benefits from that as you get from a kind of mantra meditation. But also, prayer, like devotional prayer. I haven't prayed very much in my life. There have been times as a monk where you're just kind of in a state of spiritual desperation. And it's like, anybody out there who's willing and able to help, please do so. And in a way, it's kind of throwing yourself on the mercy of some higher power or higher powers, even if you don't know who those higher powers might be. In a way, it's humility, practice of humility. That sort of thing is also spiritually beneficial. And there's been many cases of people in Christianity and other systems too. I think the most famous cases are in Christianity, where someone is trying to be saved through their own efforts. They're trying to be a saintly person and they just keep failing. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak and all that. And so finally they just kind of surrender. It's like, I can't do it, God. I just throw myself on your mercy. If I get into heaven, if I'm saved, it will be through your grace, because I just can't do it. And that kind of holy desperation resulting in that kind of prayer, that can be a total game changer. That can really just cause something to click, and you're like at a higher level of consciousness once you stop like trying to get yourself there and just let go. So yeah, that too. Devotional practices in general, it depends. It depends on where you're at, what your motives are, that kind of thing. But certainly prayer can be spiritually beneficial, even if the deity you're praying to isn't even real. Just through the meditative aspect of it, or the humility aspect, the surrender aspect, all these kind of things can be definitely spiritually beneficial and can even result in like a major upheaval and just an opening up of something that had been blocked for years. And so that's it. That's the last question of this Q&A. And again, I got the new book out, which talks about visiting morgues and stuff. So there's that to look forward to. And so just check out the URL links below. Like and subscribe if you have not done so already. Assuming that you like this. I don't know why you'd still be hanging around if you didn't. And what else? There was something else. Oh yeah. If you think I can answer any question, feel free to ask. And no more than 3 questions per person, please. And be happy.